Hello and welcome back to my channel and to my Pier Paolo Pasolini retrospective, and this is the final instalment, and it's about a lovely jolly film called Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom. Yeah, I watched it again for this retrospective. I went through it for you, friends. I did. I have not seen this film since my 20s, where it made a huge impact on me. So powerful was the impact of this film on me in my 20s that for days afterwards I couldn't get it out of my mind. Genuinely the most disturbing film I've ever seen. You know how that feeling of furriness on your teeth when you've had a drink of Coke? That's how I felt. That's what it made me feel in my insides, in my psyche. And so part of what I want to do in this video, I want to review it as I saw it then as a 20-something, and as I saw it now as a 53-year-old, where I found, rather to my horror, that I wasn't disturbed by it at all. What's happened to me? I've become some kind of maniac. Anyway, we'll go into that in a bit later. But let's set up Salo. So here we are. We're coming to an abrupt end to Pasolini's career. Of course, he didn't know that soon after this film he'd be murdered and left by a roadside in very controversial circumstances. But how does this film come into being? We've had this trilogy of life, this celebration of bawdiness, earthiness, sex, vitality, fun, peasant life. And suddenly we get this complete volte-face. And suddenly sex becomes horrible and becomes rape and becomes about power. But how did this happen? Partly Pasolini said that he felt disillusioned. He sort of turned against the trilogy of life. He felt he turned against the movies, and this is a kind of response to them, a sort of negative response. But also what's happening here is the key element that you have to remember about the trilogy of life is it's the earthiness, the instincts of the normal working person in a kind of revolt against the morality of the upper classes. So in this film, Salo, a kind of response to that trilogy, Pasolini shows what it's like if you take those earthy instincts, but now the authorities, the top-down, take control of it. And suddenly it looks horrible and ugly. What had seemed beautiful and innocent and pure and fun becomes a means of exerting power. So what you get throughout this film, where these aristocrats basically murder and torture, is that every beautiful inclination sexually becomes perverted. So they will marry off this young man and this woman, but as soon as they try to consummate their marriage in front of this audience, the fascists jump in, and one of them takes the boy and one of them takes the girl. So what they do is they manufacture this wedding, so they control it. But even when it's being consummated, they control it. This is a film about how those instincts are co-opted, exploited, abused, and controlled by authorities. Now, this is done in the form of an adaptation of the book by the Marquis de Sade. Let's just talk about the Marquis de Sade for a second, right? The Marquis de Sade was a French aristocrat who's been portrayed by some people as a great libertarian, a great, libertine, someone whose books are really about the ultimate freedom of the individual. But in his time, he was a fighter and a politician in some ways, but he was also put in prison a lot for being criminally insane, because he did write a lot about, sexual practices, rape, torture, and particularly, we have to mention this, pederasty. There was a lot of pederasty in Salo, 120 Days of Sodom. I mean, the youths that are taken into the aristocrat's castle are all teenagers. And this is reflected in Pasolini's film, where many of the stories which are told to excite the aristocrats are about the abuse of children, and really full-on abuse of children, or about cavorting with teenagers between the ages of 13 and 15. It's quite specific. So de Sade in his time was a very, very controversial figure. He was locked up in prison many times. And it's interesting that image of de Sade has kind of filtered down into popular culture, so that, for example, in the 1970s in Britain, there's a rather wonderful horror film by Freddie Francis called The Skull, where there's this skull that can transport itself through the air and chase after you and can exert an evil, malign influence on you. And it's the skull of the Marquis de Sade, who in the script is called the most evil human being who ever lived. So it's interesting, you know. On the one hand, there's some intellectuals who see de Sade as this avatar of extreme liberty, individual liberty. Other people see him as extremely evil. The book in question, The 120 Days of Sodom, is interesting. It was written in 1795, but it was not widely published, you know, for the public. A few connoisseurs and people who were interested had access to it, but it wasn't published until 1904. And even then, it was only published for experts or academics who were interested in sexual deviance. It was only widely published to the public in the 1960s. Isn't that interesting? I didn't know that until I looked it up online. Isn't that interesting? We think of de Sade as just part of the cultural, European cultural landscape, but in fact it's very recent. And so that gives an interesting piquancy to Pasolini's film, because actually it's only a decade or so after de Sade has become in the popular imagination. It's worth remembering that. Now, the thing is that the original book, I haven't read it, right, and I have no intention of reading it, but it's full on, right? You know, some people might think, oh, this is this old thing from the 1700s, I bet it's quite twee. It ain't. In fact, if you read the synopsis of it, it's probably more horrible than Pasolini's film. I've often read that people say that Pasolini's film is a loose adaptation. I'm not just sure about that, actually, because it actually follows the structure of the book quite closely. So what happens is, in de Sade's book, these four aristocrats, they get loads of youths they hire some guards who are called fuckers. That's what they're called in de Sade's text. And they're almost like capo. You know how the Nazis conscripted Jewish people to help them in the way, like sort of sergeants or lieutenants to help them, in the death camps. Well, this is what in de Sade's book happens. They hire these guys to help them kidnap these youths who are teenage boys and teenage girls. They lock them up in a castle and they proceed to torture, rape, abuse them, do all sorts of things to them, right? And what happens is it's structured, right? So there are these four storytellers, or boards, and they come down into the hall and they start telling sexy stories, often about pederasty, to get these men excited, and they can go off and do anything they want while the stories are being told. Now, Pasolini adheres to that structure very, very closely. He changes the setting. The setting is the late part of the Second World War, and it's set in Salo. Salo is a lakeside town in northern Italy, and it's where the Mussolini government was sort of deposed around 1943 in central Italy, and it decamped to Salo, where it set up a sort of proxy government overseen by the Germans, and that's why it's set in Salo. And what Pasolini does, so he takes four fascists, which represent all the pillars of the state. So there's someone from the church, there's someone from government, etc. And they hole up in a aristocratic mansion, and they use these capo to go and get some youths in, and then they hire four sort of madams to come down and tell them stories, right? Which itself opens up an ironic space for Pasolini to comment on the relationship between artists and state, because these storytellers are like artists weaving stories to get these fascists excited. So there's a sort of satire here on how propagandists and artists collude with the state. The whole structure of the film is quite unusual. It's almost like a mask. You know, that kind of entertainment that developed in Britain in the sort of early 1600s, around about Shakespeare's time. The Mask was a kind of half theatrical event, half pageant, half dance, right? So it wasn't like a theatre play. It was more like a pageant or a dance where with different characters, archetypes that played out sort of fables or allegories. And actually that's the feel of this film. It's not like a narrative film. It's almost like a sort of almost like a staged pantomime almost. And the staging of the shots really recalls this. So every time one of these madams comes down to tell the story, it's like a Hollywood shot. You get this wide shot of the room with a staircase coming down, and she comes down in all her glitz and gowns. And it's almost like a sort of Hollywood number. And then she starts to tell her story. It's a very self-consciously, over-the-top Baroque styling, which gives the film a very modern sense. But essentially it sticks to, say, de Sade's structure. So it's a pretty horrible film. I want to now separate off and talk about how I felt about the film when I first saw it as a 20-something, and then talk about how I felt about it now. When I was a 20-something, it really deeply shocked me. And it was a film that instantly became a benchmark film for me. Now, when you're younger, you want to challenge yourself. And you want to cut through the crap, don't you? All the lies of society. You want to look into the abyss. And this is the film that does it better than any other film. But is it just an exercise in horribleness, right? Is it just an exercise in gross exploitation? No. Why? Because even though it's a relentless series of horrors, right, it has an intelligence behind it, a great filmmaker. And I think a moral structure. Now, this is where it's going to be difficult to explain, so bear with me. There were moments that stuck with me. That horrible moment where that girl gets tripped up, the first rape you actually see. She's tripped up as she's serving dinner and the man just casually gets down on all fours and rapes her. That scene, and the same woman later on, when all the women have been put in a barrel of shit, and she screams, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Even now, that scene gets to me in a way that I don't really understand. And then that fantastic, horrible shot right at the end of the film where they've finally resorted to torture. And they start killing that boy and pulling out his tongue. And each of the fascists in turn is set up like a god on a throne, overlooking it through a window. And they're looking through binoculars. And the shot that most disturbed me in the film was he turns the binoculars so that the focus now is further away. So he's distancing himself from it. A more Olympian, godlike, detached view where the whole courtyard opens up. He's no longer focusing in, he's focusing out. And that sort of sense of playing with a godlike Olympian detachment about the horrible torture of these human beings is something that stayed with me for days. There's another scene that I think is incredible, and that's the scene where they find out that one of their capo has been having sex with the black female attendant, right? So he's doubly breaking their laws in a way. And they go down to find him, and he's having sex with her, and she runs away to the side, and the guy stands and he puts his fist up in the air in defiance. It's a gesture that is beautiful but also ridiculous. And you cut to the faces of the fascists, and that's exactly what's on their faces. They're sort of horrified, not just that he's defying them, but it's so ludicrous, and they just shoot him dead. Those scenes stay with me for days afterwards. And the thing is, those scenes stay with you because of intelligence. Any old arsehole can put loads of horror on screen, rape, goo, things slopping out. It just becomes boring. If something stays with you, it's because it's grounded in a structure and an intelligence. So what is the nature of this structure and intelligence? I think Pasolini's really thought about this, and it's interesting, you know. I don't think I've known any other film where in the opening credits it has a bibliography. It has a bibliography of essays about de Sade, perhaps Pasolini warding off any accusations of just putting sexual crap on screen. So he puts in a bibliography to make sure, I've thought about this. But I think he really has thought about it. The reason why the film struck me so much, apart from the horribleness of it, is this. What struck me about the movie was it goes back to an essay written by George Orwell that I've mentioned on this channel before, but I think is one of the most important essays I've read in my life. And it's George Orwell's essay about anti-Semitism in Britain. And Orwell wrote this essay in the 40s during the war, and he observed that there was anti-Semitism in Britain. And he said, well, how do we look at this? How do we understand it? And he said, the first question you must ask yourself is this. Not, why are those people over there anti-Semitic? But why might I be anti-Semitic? And this is an extremely important moral point. Because the moment you say, those people over there, you've acquitted yourself. You've absolved yourself of any guilt. And that shows a plank in your eye. Are you really absolved of any guilt? No. The moment you've said that, you've made a moral misstep. You've assumed superiority. Orwell says you must never do that. You're never going to understand the people who are anti-Semitic if you don't question yourself. That must be your first moral step. And so for example, coming to de Sade, I remember in the 90s, there was a film called Quills. Do you remember this film? Made by the American director Philip Kaufman, which was about the Marquis de Sade. It starred Geoffrey Rush and Kate Winslet. And that was a classic example of where de Sade is this character. Let's look at him, he's over there. It's complete crap. And to me, what happens in Salo is, Pasolini says, no, I'm not going to put Sade over here. And this is why the film is so disturbing, but also moral. He says, I'm de Sade. What's sadistic in me? What is Sardian in me? And then what he does is he proceeds to investigate these ideas, not just putting out fascist fetishes, but his own. You see, what struck me about this film is how much of the imagery in the film is homosexual. I mean, if you didn't know that this film was made by a gay director, it's fairly obvious it's made by a gay director, but if you didn't know, you might think it was homophobic. It has this obsession with the anus. It has, it's clear that most of the men, the fascists, are drawn to anal intercourse. It's clear also, for example, that the sexual politics of the film is intriguing. Notice how the women are very much victims. There's a horrible thing where there's this girl who's just seen her mother killed by the fascists, and then she's forced into this sex slavery. The women are the only ones who talk between each other about how awful it is and how can they get away. The boys, on the other hand, almost seem to be complicit, almost seem to be enjoying it. Almost seem to be enjoying being the apple of the fascist's eye. So you see, there's almost a queasy kind of homophobia here, right? That you could accuse Pasolini of, right? But that's what I thought was so powerful and I admired so much. Pasolini was not dissociating himself from de Sade, though I think he clearly despises him and what he represents, and the fascistic nature of his idea of power over the people, which I agree with for what it's worth. But he's saying, no, I'm not going. If I'm going to understand sadism and fascism, there's no good me saying it's over there and I'm lily white. I'm going to look at it in me. And so that's why he brings this look at his own sexuality into the film. I mean, at one point in the dialogue, he actually makes an analogy between sodomy and killing. It's extraordinary, because the idea that, because in sodomy you're not procreating, which would be the heterosexual end of sex. It's an extraordinary line of dialogue. And you might think, wow, a gay man is saying this. But the thing is that, first of all of us, whatever our sexuality, sex is both the ultimate desire and the ultimate disgust, isn't it? All our swear words, our sexual organs, fuck, cock, the C word. There's this weird kind of interplay in our minds between the wonder of sex and the horror of it, right? And that's what he's exploring, and his own sexuality being homosexuality, he's exploring that aspect of it. But he's also exploring his own fetishes, his own fantasies of power and domination. He's putting them in the movie. And that's why the film is so disturbing, because we're not put at a remove from it. We're not allowed to sit there and say, oh gosh, look at these horrible people. No, the director, because he's putting himself, puts us into the film. But that's also a moral perspective. Because if we're sat out there absolved, we're home free. Whereas if we're in there, and this horrible, peculiar world of fetishism is something that the director is bringing us into, then we can't subtract ourselves. We know that this is something that we are also part of. I want to further explain what I mean by this. I want to do a comparison with a filmmaker who many of my subscribers ask me about and I really, really despise. And that is a filmmaker called Michael Haneke. And I think it's germane to look at Michael Haneke in relationship to this film. Let's take a film called Funny Games, which he made in the late 90s and which many people admire, and I think is fucking despicable. And I hate it. Why? Now, what happens in Funny Games is this. We get this nice couple living in a house. Two boys come in and proceed to torture them and abuse them. And one of the ways the film works is they keep turning to the camera and talking to us and addressing us, saying, you're enjoying this, aren't you? You want us to do this, don't you? So Haneke commenting on our complicity as an audience, wanting to see violence. I find that despicable for this reason. Because it's having your cake and eating it. It's putting lots of violence on screen, but Haneke puts himself in the position of almost being sort of like a teacher, like a morality teacher at a school, wagging his finger saying, you like all this stuff, don't you? You want to see all this sex and violence, don't you? By having that schema of bringing the audience in and saying, we're complicit, actually what he's doing is creating a distanciation, right? We're sort of told, this is your worst aspect. It's very naughty, isn't it? Shouldn't be doing this, should you? Pasolini doesn't do that. Pasolini leaves us alone with this horror and brings us into its cycle of sex and desire and fetishism. You see the subtle but important difference there. You know, Haneke is exhibiting himself as a moralist, but getting away with it at the same time, while also distancing himself and making him seem morally, pure and rigorous. I find that revolting. Pasolini, on the other hand, is saying, look, I want to find out what's deciding about me. I'm going to reveal my, predilections. So, for example, think about how this film was made. Pasolini would have had to go through young male actors, checking out their body and how big their cocks were and how attractive they were. He'd have had to have women, as you see at the start, they have their clothes pulled down for these people to judge them, which is exactly what Pasolini would have had to do as a director. You see, he's putting himself in the actual making of the film. Now, some people might see that as horrible, and it is, but that's the point. That's a moral perspective to say, I'm not above this, I am this. Whereas Haneke really is saying, we're all this, aren't we? But I'm going to position myself as the tutor, the teacher that shows you your naughty error of your ways. I find that revolting. And the fact that that film is held up as a great film and that this film is despised, I think shows the moral problems of our age, really. So that's what really impressed me when I was in my 20s, and that's why this became a benchmark film for me. Now, fast forward, right, to 53, and I'm a horrible, cynical, desensitized, decadent 53-year-old. I've got problems. And I watch this film and think, oh, that's quite interesting. And then I turn it off. I've got problems. What struck me more about Salo this time round is, what a strange film this is. Going back to this kind of mask-like, structure that it has, it sort of reminded me of the modernism of Theorem and Pigsty. It's kind of, in order to reject the Trilogy of Life and its rambunctiousness, it goes back to that sort of quite cynical, modernism of Theorem and of Pigsty. And at the same time, it sees Pasolini going into new territory. It's interesting, where would he have gone? We were used to thinking of Salo was his last hurrah, Where would he have gone if he hadn't been murdered? Where could he have gone after this movie? Because it's a movie it's almost getting rid of, narrative structure almost. It's a kind of piece of avant-garde theatre almost. I just don't know where he would have gone with it afterwards. Another aspect about this film that I was struck by, when I was younger, I was thinking about all the horribleness. But when you're older, you're a bit like that guy reversing his binoculars, and you sort of look back. The use of music, decadent jazz on the soundtrack, the production design, is a fascinating mixture of this kind of Art Deco, rather gaudy and unpleasant and ugly architecture and, art and decor of the time. Though weirdly, I haven't quite looked into this, but I know that the fascists hated modern art, and yet some of the art on the walls approaches modern art. So I'm kind of interested. It's a queasy mix, But also these rooms, it's a kind of unused sort of castle. So you get this very modern for its time, kind of icky modern decor mixed with this severity of an unused castle. And that is an incredibly powerful environment for this film to take place in. The film is also, of course, a criticism of fascism. And one of the things that's interesting about how Pasolini investigates that is that he sees that the more power someone gets, the more it becomes like a sort of self-victimization. So that these men become obsessed with being pissed on or being cracked on or becoming, victims in the sort of sexual game, to the point where they become infantilist, where they want to be babies, where they want to lose total control. It's Pasolini's very acerbic comment, not just on fascism, but also on the sort of consumerist world. I mean, people are eating shit here, guys. It's not very subtle. But on the consumerist world that has come, forward since the Second World War. What do I make of this film at the end? Is it a masterpiece? It's an impossible film to recommend. It's an impossible film to like. I don't even know what I think about it. But I know that if I hadn't got this film as a benchmark and a way of discussing the morality of film, the ethics of film, I'd be worse off. I remember, I don't know if you've ever come across this story in film history, but the French film critic Serge Danny was very fond of quoting that the first major moment for him in his cinephilia was when Jacques Rivette apparently took exception to a film called Capo. It was made by an Italian director called Gillo Pontecorvo. Now, Pontecorvo is a filmmaker I'd liked in the past. He made films like Battle of Algiers, he made films like Burn. And what is interesting about Pontecorvo's films is, what he does is he takes real political situations, historical situations, and he investigates them through sort of action movie style, like a sort of Sergio Leone style, with pounding Ennio Morricone scores, big, bold, brushstrokes. And I think in Battle of Algiers and Quemada, that works brilliantly, right? But in Capo, before he made those two movies, he made a film about the death camps, the Holocaust. He made a film about a young woman whose her family are killed. She's on her own. She's taken to the camp. And to survive, she becomes a capo. And she starts to, betray her compatriots, sort of thing. And what Jacques Rivette objected to is there's a scene where this girl is killed. Well, one of the women is killed. And she's hanging on a piece of barbed wire. She's shot and the camera goes up to frame her in the barbed wire. And Rivette thought that prettification of suffering was worthy of the highest contempt. Right? And a few months ago, I decided to watch the film because I wanted to see that, because that's how I feel about Michael Haneke's Funny Games. I had that same kind of moral disgust that Rivette apparently had for this film. But I went back and watched Capo, right? I wanted to test how I felt about it. In fact, the film has many problems. Part of the problem is that structure that Pontecorvo has of this kind of grand Sergio Leone-esque melodrama just doesn't work when you're approaching something like Auschwitz or the Holocaust. That genre just doesn't work in communicating the horror of that situation. It's a horrible, queasy mix, right? And the film is problematic for its narrative because what this woman becomes hardened and becomes cynical and survives, at any cost. But then she meets this kind of noble Russian and she starts to fall in love, and it's like, come off it, mate. You're having your cake and eating it, rather like Michael Haneke did. But you see, the reason I mention that story is because in the same way that for Rivette and Danny, that Capo incident meant a great deal, this film meant a great deal to me. In some ways, it marshalled my thoughts about the ethics and the politics and the morality of filmmaking as much as anything I've ever seen. And that's why, even though watching past, say there was a really horrible experience, I still value it. I really do value it. It's worth watching just once in your life if you've got the stomach for it. It's worth wrestling with it and seeing where you come out, what side you come out on. So there we go. I'm exhausted after all that. I didn't know if I was going to be able to articulate why this film meant so much to me, but I think I've got there. So that's the end of my Pasolini retrospective. I am going to be doing a follow-up top 10 ranking. It won't be one of my, I won't do a big introduction and all that. I'll just do a little ranking, just for completeness' sake. That's coming up pretty soon. But thanks for following me through this retrospective. I've really enjoyed it. It's confirmed my love of Pasolini as a filmmaker, an extraordinary filmmaker. Thanks very much.